Greetings and welcome to the latest edition of the Entheogenic Evolution podcast. As always, I am your host Martin, and I'm happy to have you with me today. For this week's episode, my guest is author Elina Teboul, and she is here to talk about her new book, Feminine Intelligence: How Visionary Leaders Can Reshape Business for Good. Now, while that might not sound like that is relevant for this particular podcast, it is, because Elina credits her own personal transformation into accepting feminine intelligence to her work with psychedelics, primarily MDMA and psilocybin, and really opening up a new perspective on how to do business and how to do good in the world. As we discuss in our conversation that we're at a strange place in time currently here in the United States with the current administration, where this conversation, if it were posted on a government website, it probably would be removed and would be labeled as expressing improper ideology, which is just a sign of the times of where we are at in the United States right now, where a conversation like this would be removed for being improper. But here it is on the podcast, and I'm happy to bring it to you. We'll get to that in just a moment, but first, a few announcements. As I have mentioned the past couple of weeks, that I have now set up dates for the next round of my 5-MeO-DMT Integration Specialist training course with Mindscape Institute. That is going to be starting on September 17th, so it's going to be a fall term class. It is a 9-week course. It is open to 15 students, and enrollment is now open. You can stop by at mindscapeinstitute.org if you would like to opt in, which does not obligate you to anything, just get you more information about the class. And I also have some information and links up at my integration website, nondualentheogenicintegration.com, if you'd like to check it out there. And you can also just shoot me an email at martinwball@gmail.com if you would like more information. I've already had one person sign up, so that's exciting. Obviously, this is still several months away, but I expect that the class will eventually fill, and looking forward to teaching that in the fall. Speaking of integration, of course, I am always available for 30, 60, or 90-minute calls, video calls, that is, to help you integrate your entheogenic experience. I specialize in 5-MeO-DMT experiences, but of course, I'm not limited to that in any way. And speaking of integration, over the past couple weeks, I've been working to create some foreign language translations of my books, 5-MeO-DMT Integration: Embodying Non-Duality is Not What You Think, and also Entheogenic Liberation: Unraveling the Enigma of Non-Duality with 5-MeO-DMT Energetic Therapy. I have Spanish language versions of both of these books are now available at Amazon in paperback and in Kindle ebook. And also I have a French translation of Entheogenic Liberation, and a French translation of 5-MeO-DMT Integration is on its way. So that's kind of fun, kind of exciting. I don't know how well those books will do in those translations, but they are now available. And actually, just to bring you up to date, there are also Spanish language translations of my book, Being Human: An Entheological Guide to God, Evolution, and the Fractal Energetic Nature of Reality, which has been available for several years now. And also my short little handbook. There's a Spanish language version of God's Handbook for Operating Human Vehicles, a no-nonsense, no-strings-attached approach to universal being. And as one last announcement, just want to remind you that if you would like to support this podcast, it's quite easy to do. Stop by my Patreon page at patreon.com/martinwball, or swing by my personal webpage at martinball.net, which can also get you to my Patreon page. And there are levels of support everywhere from $1 a month up to $100 a month, which also gets you a 1-hour monthly video call with me to discuss whatever you would like to discuss. There is no obligation. You can change your level of support or cancel at any time and choose what is best for you, how much you would like to support this podcast, and how much support you would like in return. Okay, that's all I have to say for right now. Let's go ahead and get into this conversation with Elina Teboul. Her website is elinateboul.com, and also you can link directly to her book, feminineintelligencebook.com, and both of those links will be available in the podcast description and notes. So, here's my conversation with Elina. I hope you enjoy. Well, I am welcoming on to the Entheogenic Evolution podcast today, Elina Teboul. Am I saying your last name correctly?
Yes.
Okay. And I just finished reading your new book yesterday. It's Feminine Intelligence: How Visionary Leaders Can Reshape Business for Good,
Mm.
which I got to say, I really enjoyed reading the book. And if you wouldn't mind, I'd actually like to just make a couple statements before I get into asking you questions.
Sure.
So I thought it was quite interesting that here we are, that we're recording this on Tuesday, April 29th, which just so happens to be President Trump's 100th day back in office. And reading your book, a number of things jumped out. One is that I was imagining, well, if this book actually was in Elon Musk's AI database, it would absolutely have been flagged for improper gender ideology, probably even with ideas that are counter to our national security because you talk about protecting the environment, which has just gone down the toilet with this administration, and the virtues and values that you promote within the book about cooperation, about empathy, about collaboration, not working from a transactional worldview, not working from a zero-sum game playing, just pretty much reading this book. I mean, I've never been a supporter of President Trump and that whole MAGA movement, and really a lot of the points that are raised in your book are exactly why. Because I don't see anything that you write about in your book from this changing the world of business for good. I don't see a single one of those points or virtues reflected in the current administration. And so I thought, well, how interesting to have a conversation around these topics today, marking the 100th day of President Trump. So, yeah, that's what I wanted to say, that I loved the book and just thinking like, wow, none of this is being implemented right now. And we're going completely in the other direction. So it just seems like actually a very timely opportunity to have a conversation around these topics.
Yeah, it's a interesting introduction. And, obviously I was writing this book before the election, before, this current administration came into office. And I was writing at a time when I thought that, this whole idea of conscious capitalism was really taking center stage. And at that point, we were still allowed to talk about, ESG and DI.
Yeah.
Even though I don't actually use those words much in the book because I'm a pretty center political person, and I think part of what feminine intelligence for me is to try to really see things from different perspectives. And there's a part of me that hopes that with the Trump administration, there's an element of kind of form over substance. Now, I think that there are obviously in any administration things that are positive, and they're not sometimes hard to find, but I do think what happens is even when good ideas, like good economic ideas, for example, come out of that administration, they are delivered in a way that is antithetical to feminine intelligence. And they're delivered in a way that doesn't have any empathy for the people that they are hurting.
Yeah.
Now, if I take DI as an example, as someone who has, worked in the corporate world, who advises many leaders globally, I can really wholeheartedly understand that there's the ethos, the principles, and the desires for equity and inclusion. And then there's the practical implementation in organizations, which often doesn't work well. And very often, these kinds of programs that have really good intention are constructed in a way that does not progress the organization's, mission and values, and let alone like economic objectives. And so I do think, just coming at this like in a very practical, open-minded way, which I try to do, is to say, okay, well, is this an opportunity to reevaluate certain things that are not working? And I think that, again, from my leadership advisory work, have come across leaders who say, it's not politically favorable to talk about DEI, I'm still really committed to these values. But I also recognize that it just hasn't worked well in the way that we've been doing it. That there's been a lot of like check the box and creating structures that were working for the political time then that don't really work well. So I hope that the values and the principles continue to stay and that leaders will be courageous and make sure that their organizations are filled with empathy and that people continue to be, seen, heard, understood, respected, and the diversity of thought, which is mission critical for economic impact, continues to be there, even if we have to, reformulate some of the structures and change some of the language around practices that might not be, politically popular today.
Yeah, well, I like the way that you just addressed that the idea that there is obviously lots of room for reform within the political, socio, economic makeup of both the United States and elsewhere around the world, that a lot of people are feeling that things are not working for them. And I think
Yeah.
that that's completely legitimate. And it is about how do we go about doing it and what values do we bring into that? Again, reading your book, that I'm seeing all these examples and these references and this talk about these different virtues and kind of putting it under that umbrella of feminine intelligence. And I'm really agreeing with a lot of what's in there. And then what I see coming out of the current administration is, well, just to be blunt, a lot of just lies, a lot of just fabricated information, and seems to even have a taking pleasure in being cruel and not going to the extreme opposite end of being empathetic and understanding and compassionate and actually looking at how is this impacting real people in their lives, in their communities, but just kind of, with the Elon Musk example of literally just like taking a chainsaw to everything
Yeah.
and not caring about where the chips fall. And
Yeah.
it's very hard to observe that because sometimes, I am critical sometimes on social media and people say, well, oh, so does that mean you support fraud or you support alien terrorists in our country? It's like, well, I draw the line at authoritarianism and total bullshit. And that's what I feel is we're being fed by this administration. And so that there might be some laudable goals within that, but the methodology and then also the entire ethos around how it's being implemented, it hurts my heart, honestly. It just
Yeah.
doesn't make me feel good
And
as a
I,
human being.
it resonates a lot with me. And I have to say that it's hurt my heart in the prior administration as well. And this is kind of the problem with politics is that even this idea of empathy and actually understanding what is in people's hearts and how to ensure that people are whole and joyous. Like Trump could not have won if the Democrats were truly taking care of the country and if the Democrats were attuned to the pain and fears that were happening for, 50% of the population that decided to vote for the right. And, it's very interesting because I always consider myself to be very center and that center seems to be getting smaller, right? Like we
Yeah.
used to be here and now we're really far apart. And I find that to be really interesting because, like, where were the Democrats that this was allowed to happen? How come we did not wonder what is happening to our, young people and why did we assume so much about what people's values and beliefs
Yeah.
really were that we could have been so mistaken and been blind to a lot of people's pain, which the Trump administration was really able to tap into. And I truly believe that that hate comes from misunderstanding, and what I don't ever want to sort of perpetrate is like continuous hate, because then the pendulum swings really far the other way and it's constant battle, right? And for me, the idea of the feminine is like, how do we bring together the collective as a whole? And obviously, on this podcast, especially what comes to mind is that research that was done with ayahuasca with, Palestinian and Israeli soldiers,
Yeah. Oh,
where,
such a good example in your book. Sorry to interrupt you, but I just wanted
yeah,
to say that. Yeah. So please go ahead, continue.
yeah, it just really comes to mind now because I think we're obviously, it's very different, but in a similar context where there's so much raw emotion. There's a lot of history, there's a lot of pain, not, nearly as much as in the Palestinian and Israeli conflict, but there, I mean, can you imagine the beauty of psychedelics, which I know that we all on, all the listeners here really appreciate and understand that raising that level of consciousness can bring us together. And if, a Palestinian or an Israeli soldier in that altered state of consciousness can imagine themselves as being on the other side, as being compassionate for the other side, as wanting to come together in one of the deepest, most, excruciating conflict of our like species in our human history, then it really does make me wonder, like, how can we tap into that intelligence so that in the US this the divisiveness and the division and the hostilities can cease. And I think, for me, this is why I'm so passionate about psychedelics, because I do think, there is a way that we don't have to constantly, find fault with each other, and that we can find more empathy and we can come together.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I also just wanted to make it clear to my audience, which I've done before, but I'll do this here now with you, that I myself, I've always been an independent. I've never registered with any political party. And I appreciate that you mentioned like the center, because I do feel that things have become so binary, so polarized, and so extreme that it's very hard for people just to find that kind of human centeredness. Like, we're
Yeah.
all people, we've all got lives that we're trying to live. And how can we work constructively with each other? And it just made me think of when I was in high school, I took this little political test that had like this little chart and grid, and you were supposed to answer these questions. And then based on your answers, you were supposed to, mark where you were in the grid. And I was really curious when I did that, because my mark was in the exact center
Mm.
of the political grid. Anyway,
You and I have that in common. I've never I've never registered for any party. I can say it's impossible, because there are some issues that, make sense for me on one side, that make sense on the other side. And at the end of the day, a lot of these issues also, like, I don't know how like your views on economy and your views on like abortion, why they have to be like lumped together, and they don't make sense for me. So I try to steer clear of, picking sides, and do hope that, most people, I think very vocal voices, the voices that the AI algorithms tend to amplify, are the voices of hate and
yeah,
division, because that's what draws eyeballs. And so we have to remember that we also live in a technologically misconstrued world, where the reality is that most people are good people who are in the center, and who do not, truly wish for other people to be, disenfranchised. And I really worry about people, like the Tate brothers, for example,
yeah,
who are taking a situation. So, we had many years of promoting, diversity, promoting women, and we have forgotten about our boys, because we thought, well, men always, had it easy, and they were always had the advantages. And I recently heard Scott Galloway, who's a NYU professor. He said, and it really stuck with me. He's like, I'm like a 50-year-old white man, and I had a lot of privileges in my life, but it's not fair that the 19-year-old boys today are the ones who have to pay for it. And I thought that was really true too. Like, I write about feminine intelligence, which for me is not about gender. And it is about us coming together and not imposing blame on anyone. Because when we impose blame, then it creates the rise of, the Andrew Tates of the world, who are able to capitalize and say, well, everything that's happening to you now is because, you're being, hated on, and that you don't have any more opportunities, and all of the kind of, fascist movements and the terrible movements throughout history have always happened because there's been a group that has been, treated poorly. And so right now it happens to be young boys, and that's terrible. And so for me, it's always about, outside thinking, compassion, and finding ways to come together.
Yeah. And I really think about that a lot. I have a son who is 18. He's going to be going out to college next year. My youngest just turned 12. And my youngest in particular, he's got his own YouTube channel about going herping and fishing. He's into snakes and lizards and birds and fish
Oh,
and stuff. And so I'm very concerned about what he's going to be exposed to, and that radicalization of young men that has
yeah,
happened from that swing back to this sense of
yeah,
hyper masculinity, hyper patriarchy, versus
yes,
what we're trying to talk about here is that internal balance as human beings, that we all have masculine and feminine qualities, that these are different energies and
yes,
different ways that we relate to and inhabit our thoughts, our emotions, our bodies, and our relationships to others at the exterior level. And that
absolutely.
I have always been about how do we find balance and then operate from a place of authenticity and
Yes,
open-heartedness, and
yes,
that sometimes it's more masculine, sometimes it's more feminine, but it is about finding that internal balance so that we can achieve these balanced relationships within our lives. And to tie it into money, that's what brings more financial success and support for everyone versus the zero sum dominator
yes,
transactional approach, which then gets roped in with the hypermasculinity that we've been seeing, and the
yes,
way that it it's a response for young men, and it's giving them a sense of empowerment, but it's also very unhealthy both for
yes.
them and for society at large, I
Yeah.
think.
What's really interesting, when I was conducting interviews for this book, there were a lot of kind of senior executive, very powerful, very accomplished women whose initial response was quite defensive. And
Yeah.
they were really nervous
Yeah.
about, like, what exactly are you telling me to do here? And are you going to, send me back to the kitchen or something? And so it was a very guarded response. And I had to, really explain to them exactly what you just said, that when you are disconnected from source, when you're disconnected from yourself, when you're inauthentic and wearing a mask, then your energy goes all out into trying to pretend to be something that you're not, instead of when your energy is fully aligned and congruent, and then you're able to, in your authentic truth, step into your power. And so it was interesting that the women were so defensive, but
Yeah.
then the men actually really resonated with the topic. And most men, I think, when they see these, the narrative around masculinity that's currently coming out of, social media, most men I know don't associate with that, and feel that that kind of masculinity is very constraining and confining, and doesn't allow for them to fully express who they are. And you could be a very kind of, masculine, manly man and have deep purpose and deep values and connect very authentically to these concepts that I'm talking about. One has like nothing to do with the other, because this is about your expression of your soul identity and of your purpose and your values. And it doesn't really matter what kind of body that comes in. And one example that I share in the book, one story, is of a U.S. Army soldier in Iraq. And so Lieutenant Chris Hughes, he was an Army soldier. It was 2003. It was this beautiful story. I remember the first time reading it, I was just like in awe of this man, because he, as masculine as you can be, is a U.S. Army soldier. And he was in Iraq. He was with his troops. And you can just imagine this scene where it's like, you're hot, you're walking for days, you have like 95 kilos on your back, you're exhausted, you're tired, you're hungry, you're on the lookout for what's going to happen. You're in charge of protecting your men. And then all of a sudden, all of these townspeople, they descended on him and his men. And you can just imagine, like, the fear response and the sort of traditional kind of linear, rational, logical response would be to take out your weapons and, get rid of everybody. And it would be a bloodbath. It doesn't matter if it's women and children, because who knows, maybe one of them is hiding a grenade. So I might as well just follow orders. And what Chris Hughes did, which was so inspiring, was he told all of the men to kneel in the dirt and to drop their weapons and just be in surrender, be in the feminine. Like, he didn't use that language, but he did say kneel and drop your
Yeah.
weapons. And that could have ended in disaster, I guess, but the townspeople, they saw this and they fell silent and they dispersed, and nobody had to die, and there was no bloodbath and nothing happened. And so you had an extremely, quote unquote masculine man, but he acted with feminine intelligence. And for me, this is a beautiful example of how, one has nothing to do with the other. And you could have an extremely, feminine woman on the outside, like looking like a Barbie doll, and she could be completely in her masculine, right? And she could be acting as cold-hearted, calculating, and fully in the masculine. So, people have this misconception of this language, and I think it's really important to redefine it so that the feminine could get its power back.
Yeah. And that it's not emasculating in that sense.
Exactly.
And that
Yes.
sometimes the soft approach, the backing down, the surrender, that is the more powerful and the more courageous option.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that it's not just about continually escalating, 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 which is how so much of international relations has, transpired, and especially war. So I thought it was a fantastic example that you brought in there. And, it definitely reminds me, thinking of like Sun Tzu's The Art of War, looking at more of like an Asian perspective of like the yin yang balance,
Yes.
right? That it's all
Yes.
about the balance, that
Yes.
there are proper ways of embodying these different energies for different purposes, for different results, and that the true warrior is the one who knows how to use both sides of that little swirly yin yang symbol,
Exactly.
know when it's appropriate, and that it's not always just about dominate, advance, conquer.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I love the way that you phrase that, because this is the point, is that it's not that feminine is better than the masculine. There's also the toxic feminine, which is, self-aware, self-judgmental and manipulative. And there's all of that, the feminine could be quite dark. So it's all about finding that balance and that integration and that wholeness. And actually, if you look at the yin yang symbol, it's not that there's like the black part and the white part. It's one flows into the other, and there's parts of darkness in the white part, and there's parts of light in the dark part, because it's a continual fluid expression of self. And that's really what, I'm advocating for, is that people have the respect for the feminine so that they can choose to step into the feminine when it's needed and the masculine when it's needed, and to be able to sort of flex different capacities and see and respect those different capacities in others. Because unfortunately today, in most of our, organizations, which is what I focus on, but really in our world, we focus and we measure and we value, really most of like the masculine approach.
Yeah, yeah, and that's certainly what's being promoted right now,
Yes.
in the
Yes.
United States. And also, there's almost the extreme caricature of the feminine as well. Thinking about I can't think of her name right now. They call her Ice Barbie. Christy Noam with Homeland Security, and she's out there all quote dolled up in makeup and hair extensions, and in front of these people who have been deported in this prison in this humiliating situation, that it's such a weird presentation of both masculinity and femininity that seems to lack this balance that we're talking about, and
Yes.
also that sense of human connection. I just really feel that that's not present. And also in
Yes.
agreement with you, it's like I don't want to say that like other administrations were necessarily better on all of these things, but it's more just speaking about what's happening now in the moment, and how
Yeah.
I think everyone is really being deeply impacted by
Yes.
this skewing into these hyper representational forms where that, again, that authentic humanness seems to really
Yes.
be missing, and that it's moving the culture in ways that
Yeah.
I personally find distressing because I don't think it's healthy for us.
Yeah. And you know what's interesting too, I think again, kind of bringing the psychedelic frame into it, is of course there are people in the administration that are very pro psychedelics and that are very open with their psychedelic use, and yet don't display this ideas of feminine intelligence. And I think that's interesting because there is research out there that actually, if you have a narcissistic personality disorder, that psychedelics could amplify that.
Yeah.
So, right? Because psychedelics don't always lead to higher consciousness and empathy and love. And, you know, very often in psychedelics, I'm sure most people have had this experience where you have this deep inner knowing and that you feel like, you know, you've seen something that other people haven't seen. I know, like, I've experienced that. And if you know, operate within kind of a normal framework, then you understand that, like, yes, you've learned something, but you're part of a collective, and you sort of understand the nuance of that and you play with it. If you have, you know, narcissistic tendencies, which political leaders kind of
Yeah.
tend to have, otherwise
And
they
yeah.
wouldn't be political
Right.
leaders. You know, it exacerbates that idea that I'm obviously right. This is the way forward. I know something that others don't, and like, please follow me. And it almost amplifies the conviction, and it almost amplifies the influence because there's so much conviction. So I think part of that is happening too, which is kind of interesting because there's always the dark side of psychedelics.
Yeah. And one of the things I always like to say about psychedelics, that kind of echoing what you said, is that, well, they tend to amplify things.
Yes.
And also, what is very important is that no amount of psychedelic use is going to violate your free will. So, in the sense that, like, if you're committed to your narcissistic, sociopathic, pathological personality, it's not going to just magically resolve that, that it actually just might amplify all of that and solidify that. Because, and here actually where we get into the feminine intelligence, the feminine energy, in that in order to, as you write about in your book, I think the wording you use is unlock your triggers and release your trauma,
Mhm.
and then strive for that transformation. In order for
Yes.
that to happen, there has to be a willingness to surrender and to let
Yes.
go and to stop fighting. But if your personality is like, I'm going to fight and I'm going to push and I'm going to be right, well, then you're not going to hit the surrender point where
Yes.
that transformation is allowed to take place. And then maybe discovering these different qualities of energy within yourself.
Yeah.
It actually makes me want to share a story with you. Do you mind if I share a quick
Yeah,
one?
please do.
Okay. So, because this was, and I actually have a song about this that's available online. It's called The Great Mother. So, my first 5-MeO DMT experience came in January of 2008. This is right before I started this podcast. And at that time of my life, I had just left my marriage. It was a long relationship of 16 years, and I had been very shut down and very unhappy within that relationship. And I moved up here to Ashland, Oregon, and someone invited me to experience 5-MeO DMT. And so I did. And that first experience was just the most amazing thing that had ever happened to me in my life. And it was just like within seconds, my experience was like, oh my God, it's God. Like, oh, this is it. Like, oh my God. And I was just so empowered and so thrilled and just invigorated by that. And then about a month later, I was invited to come back and experience it again. And I was kind of thinking, oh, it's going to be more of what happened that first time. But what happened was is I took my hit, and I don't know if you're familiar with 5-MeO, but it starts very, very quickly. Within seconds, it starts coming on, and it reaches this potential point of becoming infinite. But within seconds of having taken my hit, I could tell that I was resisting. And I just blurted out loud. I said, I'm holding on, and I don't know why. The other people in the room said, oh, it's okay, Martin. It's okay. And so then I took that internal attitude. It's like, oh, it's okay. Like, I guess I don't have to hold on. So then as I let go, what I found is that I had had years of unexpressed pain and suffering stuffed down inside me. And so then I spent about like maybe 20 minutes, I don't know the exact time, but just wailing and crying and just all of these emotions that I had never let myself experience because I had been in a very unhappy relationship and I just stuffed it all down. Just, no, I'm keep going. Anyway, I released all of that. And then by the end, I was on my back and my arms were kind of up like this and my knees were up. And then I found that I was making this motion with my mouth like this, where I was going, and then I felt like, oh yeah, like I'm a little baby. And then it felt like really viscerally, like my best description is I was sucking at the breast of the great cosmic mother. And I was just feeling the sense of all the love and nourishment I could ever need is just available right here. It's just infinite. It's immediately available. It's not something apart from me or separate from me. And then it felt like every molecule of my being, like if a mother comes up to a baby and goes like coochie coochie coo and tickles you, that's what it felt like everywhere in my body. And it was just so amazing and so healing. And then it was also I was able to recognize that this is myself. This is my own feminine energy of having surrendered and released my traumas and released my pain and be able to receive this really, really delicious, fantastic sense of love and connection. And anyway, I just wanted to share that because that's what I'm talking about when it's you got to be willing to surrender in order to find that within yourself. And that as interestingly, this whole experience also helped me resolve my own sense of masculinity because as a young man, I was very sensitive to toxic masculinity and I decided like, I don't want to be that way. And so I became more feminine. You know, like when I was in high school, everybody thought I was gay, but I wasn't. It was just, no, I'm just more feminine. Right. So this actually helped me find balance within myself. So anyway, that's my story. Wanted to share that because
Oh, I love that. That is such a beautiful story. And I think this is really like that's the essence of psychedelics, right? Because we all carry so much traumas and so much in our past. And sometimes people think, oh, if I didn't have capital T trauma, like I didn't, go to war or like something like that, that means my trauma isn't big enough to be important.
yeah,
I think there's a lot of narratives that, I'm not, I'm so privileged that I shouldn't be allowed to complain about, just my feelings. And that is such a dangerous and toxic narrative that unfortunately still, is prevailing narrative, I think, in our culture. And I had one experience that was very similar where I had MDMA, which within a very large dose of LSD. And I was with a very, very competent guide who did a sort of tremoring exercise with me, where we just got into like all the parts of my body because like that body the body keeps the score, and
yeah,
so he understood that a lot of my traumas were sitting within me. And I remember actually like feeling like I'm pulling up literally like from my womb, like black spiders.
yeah,
And there was like black spiders and black snakes and everything was black. And I was literally like pulling like out of my womb. And it was a lot of, like just the experience of being a woman and a lot of like traumas that come with that. But what you understand is if you hadn't released it through your tears, if I hadn't released it by literally like pulling out all of this venom from my womb, like that's why people get sick. This is cancer, right? Like this for me is exactly why a lot of people like it's like how did this person get sick? Like there was nothing wrong because our emotional pains, these traumas that they just sit within us, unfortunately, if we don't find a way to release them, that toxicity spreads and spreads and spreads and makes us like genuinely really sick. And then what kind of people do we show up as? Like, how can we be full of like love and empathy and compassion when all of that toxicity is sitting within us, right? So it's no surprise to me that the people who haven't done the work to release whatever they need to release are the ones who are the most fighting and the most in zero-sum game and the most in, criticizing and judging because they don't want to look in the mirror. And that's why, the kind of like organizations and worlds that we have is created because people just don't have, unfortunately, the opportunity to do the kind of experiences that probably most listeners on this podcast at least have had. And that's why, again, as a lawyer, I'm so devastated that we can't bring these, medicines, these gifts into a legal structure, because I know personally a lot of people who could benefit tremendously. And that would be a huge multiplier effect because they're, like big leaders managing hundreds of people and thousands of people, and they impact those people's mental health and daily lives. And they're not going to do something that's illegal and that's underground because
Yeah.
they're afraid. And I understand that, I really do. It's I was devastated when MDMA did not become legalized for PTSD. I continue to be baffled by the hubris of human beings who feel that they can outlaw another species that grows in the ground.
Yeah.
Like the poor mushroom. Like how have we, like, I don't know what actually gives us the right. It's like I sometimes say to people, like, can you declare that tree to be illegal? Like, I now declare the sycamore tree to be illegal. Like, it sounds ridiculous. So how can you declare the like mushroom, right? Or like
Yeah, well,
any of our other plant medicines?
that's what Australia discovered when they decided that they were going to make all DMT containing plants and
Mhm.
substances illegal, and then somebody had to point out, like, so like all your trees here, they contain DMT. You just like made your entire biosphere illegal.
Yes.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, it's really crazy. And, I write in the book about my work with the Earth Law Center, which is a nonprofit, which is like we're nature's lawyers, and we advocate for legal rights for rivers and oceans and different species. And basically, like we've created a new law called Earth Law, which is very different from environmental law. And so for me, I always look through this lens of nature's rights. Like I really think that mushrooms and cactuses, like they have a right to exist, and they have rights just like we have rights. We are nature. And of course, plant medicines communicate to us. And there's lots of research that people who have experiences with plant medicines completely change their, outlook on the climate and the environment and become connected with nature because it's speaking to us. That's the language with which Mother Earth is communicating to us. And, I think a lot about business leaders because those are the people who are able to like create a lot of change and have the resources to make impact. And I'm like, well, if I can just give them all a mushroom journey, then maybe they could be more conscious with what their organizations are creating for the environment.
Yeah. So, Lena, I really appreciate that we just kind of jumped right in. I mean, there's just so many topics that I think are fascinating here. And again, I really enjoy seeing all of these reflected in your book and all the examples and the different virtues and values that you're promoting within it. And I really want to return to this concept of being a lawyer for nature and nature's law. But what I'd like to do is actually maybe let's back up a little bit. And I'd like to invite you maybe to tell a little bit more about your own background and your own history and how you got into these different areas. And maybe you've already shared a little bit about the MDMA and the LSD experience, but how that window was opened for you within your
Yeah.
life. And then I really want to return to this idea because I think that this also is something that there's been so much happening within this current administration on so many levels, which has been very intentional, right? The whole idea of
Yeah.
like just flood the zone. But I think one of the things that we're not hearing enough about is around the environment and really the dramatic reversals that are taking place there, because no amount of money in politics are going to matter
No.
if we fuck this thing over which we're doing a good job of doing at the natural level. And this is like one of these weird, perverse things. Is like, well, reality is going to win sooner or later, and if we
Yeah.
don't get our act together around the environment, it doesn't really matter what our politics are because there's not going to be a viable biosphere that we're going to be able to live in a healthy, happy way. But anyway, let's we're going to put a pin on that. I'm going to use some corporate logo. Let's put a pin on that.
Yeah.
We're going to circle back around.
That's why they're trying to colonize Mars.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, because we got to get out of here. But I'd love to hear a little bit more of your own story. And I just wanted to comment that, I talk to a lot of people around the world every week. This is what I do. You have an interesting accent. So let's
Yeah.
start there with your accent.
Yeah. Okay. So my accent is I was born in Russia and I was 6 years old when I moved to New York. So my parents basically fled Russia in the middle of the night in when the Soviet Union was collapsing, and it's really part of the reason why the book talks so much about conscious capitalism and continues like I continue to think that this is the way that we're going to have progress because coming from a family that experienced communism and a different economic model, understood and come to really appreciate that that is worth running away from in the middle of the night and not having anyone to, not being able to say goodbye, and it doesn't work. And so, even though I think a lot of things are broken in the current model, and I think we can fix them, there's a different, more conscious approach. I think that that experience has really shaped a lot of the ideas in
Yeah.
this book. So I grew up in New York, and so the accent is sort of Russian New York. I've been married to a Parisian man for the last 12 years, so he has infiltrated my accent, and now I live in London for the last 5 years. So it's all over the place, and people are always quite interested. And my publisher thought that like a professional should read the book, and I haven't listened to my to the Audible version yet because I'm really worried to find out that it's some like very polite sounding English lady that doesn't sound anything like me. So TBD on that for anyone who's listening to the audiobook and thinks that it doesn't sound like me. They're apparently professionals. So I grew up in New York, and I think, most of the ideas of this book were all of the ideas of this book were completely not present in my upbringing.
Mm,
So we were immigrants, and it was all about money, the American dream, prestige, and success. And the messages were, you better go to like Ivy League schools, which I did. You better get straight A's, which I did. You better go to a very fancy white shoe law firm that's going to pay you a lot of money, which I did. You better carry like a designer briefcase that makes you look really important, which I did.
mm,
and and I had these like really big questions of why is this so dissatisfying? Like I did everything that my parents told me I should do. Like this is what success looks like. Why is it so empty? And like what's going on here? So I was really surprised when I was so unhappy at the law firm. Like I thought that I was exactly where I was meant to be. I worked so hard to get there, and it was a big shock and surprise for me that that wasn't enough because
yeah.
conversations around like consciousness and philanthropy and all of this, like they didn't exist in my house. Even conversations around like religion and spirituality were also missing because under communism, religion was not welcome. And so even though my parents had this like I sort of identity of being Jewish. They actually had no idea how to be Jewish, so we never did anything
Mm,
like
yeah.
about being Jewish. And so like we never went to synagogue, we never went to church, we never did anything. So this was a big part of my life that was hugely missing without me even knowing about it. And then I had this incredible opportunity to leave the law firm to work for a man called Alan Gray, who's now passed away, but is just an incredible innovator, entrepreneur, business person, philanthropist. He created the largest investment firm out of South Africa, which now has offices in 11 countries with like $100 billion of assets under management. And he decided he was going to give all of his money away to philanthropy to sponsor social entrepreneurs in South Africa. And basically told me to quit my job, take a pay cut, move to the Bermuda Triangle, and like find purpose and help him to create a foundation. So I took that deal when I had a 1 year old, not even when I had a 7 month at home and my daughter in my belly. And so I said, okay, this sounds like a good idea. And I went to work for Alan in the foundation, and this was, I would say, my intellectual awakening
Mm.
of like, oh my God, there's this thing about working with purpose and working with values, and what does that mean, and social entrepreneurship. Like these concepts blew my mind. I had no idea what he was talking about, even though at that point I was like 31 years old, and this was all like really, really new to me, because this was not talked about at the law firm. So it was my intellectual awakening, but as I begrudgingly admit in the book, I didn't fully emotionally connect to it yet. Like I still just couldn't understand, like, how did this person just give away all of his money? How is he in his 70s and coming to work every single day with this fire and purpose and mission, and not like I didn't fully appreciate what he was doing. Like I intellectually thought this was, you know, interesting and stimulating and purposeful, but like I wasn't embodied, like
Yeah.
fully embodied. And when my husband and I decided that probably raising our kids and creating a full life in Bermuda was not for us, we decided to move back to New York. And that's when I went back to school to study psychology. And this was my first experience with altered states of consciousness. So I was doing my master's in psychology at Columbia University in New York, which has a really interesting program called SMBI, which is Spirit, Mind, Body Institute.
Hmm.
And so, even though I was taking classes in the kind of normal clinical psychology, organizational psychology department, I stumbled onto this like SMBI program and thought, let me dabble and take a few classes. So I took a course in spirituality and psychology, which landed me in a holotropic breathwork 2 day workshop in the basement of Columbia University. So there I am with my sleeping bag, the lights out, the music is pumping, and I'm, breathing to get myself into an altered state of consciousness, thinking like, what am I doing? How am I getting like 4 credits towards my degree for like whatever is this like very strange adventure? And but that really piqued my interest, and I thought like, why does somebody want to change their consciousness, and what does this mean? And so I started researching, and it wasn't until a few years later that I decided, for very personal reasons, to try MDMA for the first time. And it was with a guide, with kind of an underground guide. And it was just like a lot of personal exploration, the things that we talked about, that I was like certain, like traumas, relationship traumas, dealing with my entire kind of mother line, and a lot of, I would say, intergenerational trauma that I, was trying to unpack and resolve. And so I entered into this world for kind of like personal growth and personal healing. And so as I was sort of like doing these journeys and doing the work and understanding myself, at the same time, I had my leadership advisory practice, because I had like finished my master's, I finished my executive coaching program. So I was working with a lot of leaders. And so as I was going deeper and deeper into my own consciousness and my own psychology, I was starting to understand that everybody that would present to me, who are all like very senior global leaders, they would come with their business problem, but underneath the business problem, now I was able to see was like a whole host of other issues that I
Yeah.
didn't know, that I didn't see before, because I didn't have that lens. And so then I started kind of trying to find a name for it, and that's the kind of like the genesis of feminine intelligence.
Hmm. Oh, that's an interesting turn. So,
Yeah.
if you let's maybe at this point encapsulate for the audience, what does feminine intelligence mean then?
Mhm.
Coming
Yeah.
through your own sense of personal transformation, and then how you're applying it as a quality or as a sets of qualities that could be embodied by leadership, and particularly in the world of business.
Yeah. So I always think about the kind of masculine is associated, the archetype of of the masculine is associated with left brain consciousness, with language, with linear thinking, with rational thinking, with, knowing the past, knowing the future, metrics based, numbers based. The archetype of the feminine is associated with right brain consciousness. It's chaotic, it's imperfect, it's more intuitive, it's more creative, it's empathetic, it's more focused on the we as opposed to the I. Which for in the left brain consciousness it's more it's like I'm separate from you. In our right brain consciousness it's exactly what we feel like when we're in psychedelics, that it's all love, that we are all one, and that separation goes away. And so all of these things for me are part of feminine consciousness and feminine intelligence. And I struggled to come up with like a clean definition, because I knew everybody's question is what is feminine intelligence, and give us a definition and have it be, the five tenets of feminine intelligence are. And what's interesting, and the reason I chose not to do that, and I kind of want to speak about it more with fluidity and authenticity, is because that's exactly what the feminine is. So the masculine is the one that is all about definitions, and it
Yeah.
is the one that's going to give you the 5 point plan to feminine to masculine intelligence, right?
Right, right. That'd be
And the
like
whole
mansplaining feminine intelligence.
Yeah, exactly. And that the feminine, that's sort of the whole point, is how can we finally be comfortable with chaos? How can we be comfortable without knowing the answers, and just being in our creativity, being in our intuition, and comfortable with not having language be perfectly available to us to explain exactly, what we're thinking, because there are aspects of our humanity that cannot be explained with language. And I wanted to leave it at that and to invite people to say, are there times in my life where I could be comfortable to say, with the not knowing, with the feeling, with the embodying, and with recognizing that just like, artists create music and paintings because they're trying to find a different language for something that doesn't need our vocabulary. And I think that's where the feminine really lives, and that's why I intentionally choose not to give it a very strict definition.
Yeah. And that's where, as a writer, you can, which you have done, is you bring in multiple examples of
Yeah.
this is what I'm talking about without like, here's the list and let's check off all the boxes, but
Yes.
here's an example. And that even that, in a sense, is more of a demonstration of the feminine intelligence, because what we're looking at then is embodied examples rather than a rationalized, extracted approach of what this is like. Well, here's what this person did. Here's what this
Yeah.
person did. Here's what we're doing. And so it gives that lived in example, that more
Yeah.
embodied example, I think.
Yes. And, I think for a lot of people who have never taken a psychedelic, they can't possibly imagine what it could feel like to be in a place where you're not having the emotional baggage, you're not having the narrative of your default mode network, you're not worried about, how you come across, you're not in you're not self-conscious, you genuinely love and connect to something greater than yourself. And I think this audience mostly probably has had some version of that experience. And so I think that is that part, that's the feminine, that's the divine feminine, the elusive divine feminine that you can connect to regardless of your gender. It's not just for women.
Yeah.
Women have maybe like their own version of this in some instances where, like definitely I know that with psilocybin, I very much connect to like my female body, my womanhood. And I know a lot of women feel that way too. But that's not I don't think feminine intelligence is limited to just that. I think that we can all experience the feeling of like ourselves as the divine and not have the language to explain it.
Yeah. Even just thinking about the divine and just referencing like Western patriarchal religion, that kind of a clear example is within the Abrahamic religions, God is identified as the logos, right? The word, the
Yes.
definition,
Yes,
right? The logic, the pronouncement, the
exactly.
authoritative masculine sense versus the more embodied feminine sense, and resting maybe not on the word, but more in the feeling
Yeah.
itself. So
Well, I'll tell you something funny
yeah,
about that because I have a 9-year-old daughter. And I think, like, maybe when she was 6, she came home from school and she was really excited. And she's like, Mommy, 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 you know how you always say that God is energy? Which, for a 6-year-old is like, what does that even mean? And
yeah.
she's like, no, it's not energy, it's Jesus.
Oh,
Because, like, finally at school, somebody explained to her, like, no, it's and she was like, I got it, it's Jesus. And I was like, okay, honey, that's fine. Now she's 9, so she's back to understanding that, that God is within her and God is everywhere and God is energy. But just, this search for certainty,
yeah,
I think is so deeply embedded in us that you have a 6-year-old child who has suffered through so much confusion of their esoteric mom's definition of God and energy, that when finally somebody's like, here's a picture, it's Jesus, then that certainty is just so comforting. It's like,
yeah,
oh, like, I get that. And I think this is the point, is that the feminine is scary because of its chaos and because it's unpredictable. And so there's beauty in that, but there's fear in that. And as a society, we prefer the certainty and the limitations of the masculine.
yeah. And even with the word God, I like to use the word a lot. I'm comfortable. I had my own, shift around even using the word, but I also always refer to God as it. That
Mm,
I purposely don't use masculine language with that, because for me, both these energies of masculine and feminine come out of the unitary energy that is God, that
yes.
is neither masculine nor feminine. And
Yes.
if, when push comes to shove, I would define God as the pure energy of unconditional love. And that can
Yes.
be both nurturing love, and also it can be tough love. So it can
Yes.
have these different elements of what we think of as love. But that the ultimate is not gendered in any way, shape, or
Yes.
form. We, as the
Yes.
embodiments of it, we are
Yes.
gendered because we have bodies. So we've got to be
Yes.
something. And some of us are
Yes.
somewhere in between male and female. And but all those energies are expressed through us. And of course, our biology might make one more dominant than another, but the access to both the masculine and feminine, it's all available within
Yes,
us.
for me as well, the idea that God could be gendered just seems ridiculous because,
Yeah.
well, like, but then why isn't God like a cat, and why is God human? Like, again, it goes back to this idea of we are nature, and there's just so much more to our consciousness, to our planets, that, like, the idea that God is somehow in human gendered form, for me personally, just doesn't make any sense. But the idea that God is pure love and energy is something that, again, probably particularly listeners of this podcast have
Yeah.
experienced in some way. Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to ask you now one of the practical questions that I like to get to eventually with people, because I always like to point out I've been doing this podcast a long time, and when I first started it, it was kind of hard to find guests, in the sense
Mhm.
that not many people were comfortable being open about their psychedelic experience. There was a lot more fear, a lot more sense of we've got to be closeted. And more people were writing under pseudonyms and things like that. But things have really shifted these days. But there's still a dichotomy available out there. So there's an interview that I did just the other week that's not going to come out until July because it's going to coincide with his book release. But it was also from a financial perspective. So this guy is he's an investment broker, and he said that in writing his book, he had included a lot of information about his own psychedelic experiences and how he'd come to these similar understandings that we're discussing here. But his publishers said, absolutely not. You may not have any of this information in the book. So, out of defiance, he contacted me and he said, well, can we do an interview where we talk all about money and psychedelics to coincide with when the book comes out? And I said, sure, I'm all for that. And so that was one of the questions that arose for me in reading your book is that, well, we are in a different era where people can be more open about it. But I always like to ask sort of the practical question of, did your publishers or editors, did they ever take issue with you including chapters about psychedelics and including your own narratives around your own psychedelic use and also promoting this idea that actually this can be healthy for people and that maybe we could have more of this, especially for business leaders?
Yeah, no, I have to say that Wiley, which is, one of the oldest, biggest traditional publishers, never blinked an eye, like never brought up this conversation at
Mm,
all. When I was first sending the manuscript around and speaking to different publishers, there were publishers who were worried about liability. And I almost said, like, as a lawyer, I guess, we can write a blurb at the very beginning that says something like, about safety and intentionality and we don't like something like that. But no, Wiley had absolutely no problems with it. And I would say from a personal perspective, I'm also fortunate that for the last decade, I work independently. So I don't have to answer to any boss. I don't have to answer to any organization. And so I'm not worried about, losing my job. And that creates a lot of freedom to be
yeah.
able to speak openly. And then I also think that because I'm an attorney and because I'm a psychologist and because I'm actually trained as a psychedelic assisted therapist, I did the California Institute of Integral Studies like year-long program because I approach it from a kind of academic perspective. And I have a lot of like respect for the medicines. I appreciate the nuance. I think I have almost like a duty to be able to speak about it
Mm,
because people who are quite traditional and scared, they trust that it's coming from a source that is, in their eyes, not, that's like a credible source that has read the literature and that has an understanding from a completely like masculine left brain
right.
perspective because for a lot of people like that felt feminine intelligence is something that is so foreign that it's they can't trust it. But when you show them the research studies and you explain this percentage of people in the clinical trial number 3 said this, then they believe you and then they feel safer. And I think that, like, for me, if I want to advocate for this message, then the more people that could find a guide who is going to be credentialed, who's going to make them feel safe, where they can find a jurisdiction where this is legal, they can have an experience that's going to shift their consciousness and hopefully then have a multiplier impact on the world. I do feel like I can bring that message because people in the like sort of people in the matrix still they trust me. So I feel very privileged to be able to share my perspective.
No, that's great. And of course, now people can come to Oregon. Come to Oregon,
Yes.
and we
Yes.
have our psilocybin program, and there's just going to be more of those. And we've got Colorado, Australia has, I think, legalized both MDMA and psilocybin therapies, and that's definitely what's promoted within your book is the idea of the facilitated approach,
Yes.
the educated, the trained approach, not just go off into the forest or go to a concert and take mushrooms and that's going to be your epiphany. But there's a lot of value in having guided work done with people who know what they're doing and know how to keep people safe and know what the guidelines are, that that's what helps make it productive and useful for people.
Definitely. And I think, something we talk about, obviously preparation, obviously integration. I think what's not talked about enough is the support system at home. So
Yeah.
for a lot of people who are not already in this world and who are considering it, and maybe there are people who are listening to this podcast like thinking if this is for them, I would say that one of the most important things is find your tribe ahead of time, because once you have these experiences, you're never coming back. And what's really hard is to come back to a very, like judgmental environment that makes you sort of close back down and judge yourself and not continue your expansion. So when people ask me, like, should everybody do psychedelics? I say definitely not, aside from, the people for whom, like, medically they shouldn't do psychedelics. Then, like, you need to make sure that you have the emotional resources to be able to support this growth and this expansion, that you're not left on your own, because that could be psychologically very damaging.
Yeah, it can be very, very isolating, especially when it comes to that complete sense of union, that complete sense of absorption into God. That I like to say that non-dual experience can only be one of the most ironically isolating experiences a person can ever have, because then we just like, wow, I just had this complete sense of oneness with the divine. For people who haven't had that, it's like, well, so do you need a mental institute, or like,
Yeah,
what's wrong
exactly.
with you? Like,
Exactly.
it can be very, very isolating. And this is where, like I mentioned earlier about how I talk to people around the world every week, that I offer integration services primarily around 5-MeO. And that's where I am getting people around the world. And they're almost always saying, there's no one here I can talk to about
Yeah.
this, wherever it is that they may be. And kind of in alignment with yourself, more and more what I'm seeing is more people who are lawyers and therapists and professionals and business leaders, that is just really, really burgeoning as a demographic within the psychedelic world, whereas even 5 years ago that was still very much a
Yes.
minority. So that the interest and awareness is expanding quite exponentially, and there are lots of practical questions about how do we move this more into the mainstream in a way that really is promoting the potential benefits of it. And going back to, like we were saying earlier, that, well, if we take a narcissistic personality disorder, it might just amplify it. So looking at how do we help steer this ship in a way that is most beneficial to the most people, and also not doing harm in the process.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Agree
So
with you.
harm in the process. That seems like this is a good place. Maybe we can return now to the question of law and business and the environment, because this is a place where unfortunately we're seeing tremendous amounts of harm. And here in the United States, with the lifting, pretty much the dissolution of the Endangered Species Act, and trying to get rid of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and just removing all of these environmental regulations and opening the door up to increased resource use, even redefining that, like, destroying an animal's habitat is not harm to that animal. I don't have a lot of optimism around our approaches with the environment, and so perhaps various new legal methods might need to be introduced. So let's talk more about this idea of being a lawyer for nature, and the organization that you've mentioned. So I'd love for us to dive into that a bit more.
Yeah, sure. So I agree with you. It's very concerning, and hopefully this is going to be, 4-year administration, and then we can move on to maybe an administration that is more ecologically aware. I do think that this is a particular topic that I really struggle to understand the perspective. And I think that from the tech community, which is obviously deeply embedded with the current administration, there is the hope that all of these problems will be solved with technology. Of course, that would be great, but let's see what fusion and fission can do, and that one can only hope. But I think, again, because my background is as a lawyer, I do think this is a very unique and interesting approach. And what it allows to happen is, like, for example, today, you and I could not go to court and say that we would like to stop some organization from, destroying the habitat of a species that is environmentally important, not just, any species, but also a species that could be critical for the entire ecosystem, for example. And what giving that species legal rights allows is that you can now actually come to court and you would have standing in court to make that claim. Because currently the way that environmental law works is you can only sue once the harm has happened.
Yeah.
And that's the problem, that it's very difficult to stop things from happening because of this concept of standing, that you simply don't have an environmental agency or an individual person can't allege that there is harm to them. Like if there's not harm to me, Elina, then I should not be coming to court. So that's what we're trying to do, is to say, well, this body of water is really important and it has to have its protections, and it has to have like legal standing. So this is the work of Earth Law Center. It's really exciting. We won legal status for the Marañón River in the Amazon just recently, and the women defenders who we trained to protect that river just won the Goldman Prize, which is kind of like the Nobel Peace Prize for environmentalists, and that just happened last week. So that's really great work, and I'm really excited that we're making these kind of headways.
Yeah. So, but the Earth Law Center, how many people does this involve? What is its reach?
Yeah, so it's a nonprofit organization, obviously, because nature can't pay its lawyers.
Yeah.
So we rely entirely on philanthropic donations for this work, and we have a staff of about 30, but then we have a lot of different partners and a lot of law student interns, because when I went to law school, we didn't talk about this at all. This was not a subject, but then we wrote the first textbook on earth law, and now we are training law professors to be able to teach this in law schools. We're training judges in earth law, so it's starting to become a bigger movement, but it takes time.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about the current political situation, but I would like to talk maybe just a little bit more about this, because I've got you on, and you're trained as a lawyer, and um, like Columbia University and Harvard, they're mentioned a lot in your book, and we're talking about in the environment. This is another great concern that I have, where the Trump administration has just outright declared that climate change is, quote, a hoax,
Yeah.
and is looking to take legal action against environmental nonprofits that have promoted clean energy and also climate awareness and trying to create policy to prevent climate collapse, that he wants to sue them for fraud
Yeah.
and to demand grant money back. And then we've also seen the attempt to take over, say, Columbia University, Harvard University, and also this sort of bizarre blackmailing of law firms to really kneecap anyone who might want to create a court case or a legal case that he wants to say is bullshit. And I find this very disturbing. I mean, this is authoritarianism, this is fascism, let alone the impact that it's going to have on our ability to protect the environment. Do you have any words of advice for the United States right now
Oh
around
my
this kind
God.
of
I mean,
issue?
it's terrifying, because it's the problem is, in the first administration, I think that they didn't really know how to use the levers of power,
Yeah,
and that while they were not in office, they got a lot of legal advice and became extremely adept at manipulating those levers of power. And it all started with packing the Supreme Court, which, now the problem is that we don't have the checks and balances that normally we would have with the legislature and the
right.
judicial system and the executive branch. And so they were able to create the most powerful executive branch that we've ever seen that really doesn't have to answer to the Supreme Court or to the legislative branches. And so the power is unbridled. And I don't know what's going to happen with that, really. I think that it's playing on people's the thing with the environment is it creates fear and anxiety. And I think that he's playing on this to allow his followers to think that, you're all safe. This was all a hoax.
Yeah.
And that, your tax dollars don't have to go to these agencies, and that these agencies have been violating your trust by creating this sense of fear in order to sustain themselves and pay themselves salaries. And so what like sort of from the psychology perspective, I think this is kind of fascinating because it's playing on people's emotions in such a clever way, that people are like, oh, well, thank God this was all a hoax because I don't have to worry anymore. And coming back to, I guess, the idea of feminine intelligence and an embodied way of knowing things, when my daughter was first born, for years, even before psychedelics, I would always have these nightmares that there was a flood or there was like an earthquake, and that I was running with her, and that I was always trying to save her from some sort of environmental disaster. And I think that the people who are more attuned and more conscious, they feel the palpitations of the earth in a different way, and that it's a connection that we understand that things are not as they should be. And manipulating these like emotional narratives is quite fascinating just from a psychological perspective. But from the legal perspective, I think I'm almost in awe of what he's been able to accomplish, because he's really pulled all the levers in his favor. And I don't have enough expertise in this particular topic to understand what needs to be done to undo some of these things, other than like there will be a different administration that's going to change things around. But for the next couple of years, unfortunately, I don't have any words of wisdom.
Yeah. 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 And I find myself very much with you with what you were just expressing, that on the one hand, like when I hear Trump talk about any particular topic, my honest usual response is, wow, this guy's really a fucking idiot. He doesn't know jack shit about anything. Like this, it blows my mind how little he seems to understand anything. Yet at the same time, there is this maniacal brilliance to how the system has been manipulated and how people have been manipulated, and how someone that, I've revealed this on my podcast that formerly I taught religious studies for a number of years at the university, and I would often teach intro to religion classes. And whenever we got to Buddhism, and there's the 6 realms of rebirth in Buddhism, that even before Trump ever entered into politics, that there is the realm of the Titans. And this is a level above the human realm of rebirth that is below the heavenly realm, on the wheel of samsara. And I would try and make things relatable to my students. So I would say, well, you don't want to be born in the Titan realm, because then you're always hungry for more power, and it's feeding your ego within this realm. And then there's always a continual sense of dissatisfaction because you just want more and more and more power, and you become manipulative in order to gain more power. And so I would always say, my example of that is Donald Trump. Don't be Donald Trump. That's what I would tell my students. And so in my horror, watching like, oh my God, this guy's going to become president of the United States. And now here he is back again. So there's that weird mix of like, how has he managed to accomplish this, yet still, in my impression, just not be an intelligent person, at least at a logical level. So it is befuddling, so maybe, sorry for ranting. It's really impacting like everything. So I think about this a lot. I do a lot of reading every morning. I get up and I read, well, what's going on in the world? Like what's happening? But maybe we could just kind of wrap up with this. For you personally, I think that there's a lot in your book that's very optimistic about how we can make things better. So for you personally at this point in time, what does give you hope? Where do you find inspiration? And what keeps you motivated to keep working?
Oh, yeah, I'm always optimistic. I'm an eternally optimistic person. And I think that it's all about finding like our true humanity. And that all of the ills that we see are when it's fear driven and when we are pinned against each other. And I'm hoping that there is, a rise in our collective consciousness. And I think that a lot of, great spiritual teachers are talking about this, that this is the century when it is expected that our collective consciousness is supposed to rise. And I'll end with this really beautiful prophecy that comes from, I forget specifically which indigenous group, but they share this prophecy that there's a bird of humanity and that it's been flying with traditionally just one wing, the masculine wing. And this wing has become overdeveloped and overly muscular. And that because of that, society has been flying in circles. It's been in the same flight path because of this, one dominant wing. And there's this vision, this premonition that in this century, the feminine wing of the bird of humanity will finally fully expand so that the two can find balance, which will allow the bird of humanity to finally soar. And for me, this is, the message of integrating the feminine, of, higher consciousness and a society that truly soars. And that is, that's what keeps me optimistic.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Elina. And just one last little dig about current trends. I also am of the opinion that speaking to experts is valuable and worthwhile. And I've really enjoyed being able to have this conversation with you about all of these topics from someone who is trained as a lawyer and as a psychologist and as a psychedelic therapist. I appreciate your expertise, your training, your education, and what you bring to it, and also your own humanity, your own sense of transformation, your own sense of experience and embodiment. That's what makes for a very rich conversation. And I've really enjoyed having this conversation with you today, and definitely wish you the best of luck with your book, Feminine Intelligence: How Visionary Leaders Can Reshape Business for Good. I hope it receives a wide audience, and I hope that we all find the inspiration to actually put some of this in practice so that we can help that bird get both wings nice and strong. And I'm a bird guy too, so my listeners will know that means a lot for me to say that. So thank you so much for your time today, Elina. It's been a brilliant conversation. I've really appreciated it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been really a pleasure and always really helpful to, I love the psychedelic communities because I feel like it's the space where you can understand the feminine more than almost, in any other conversation. So this has been really a privilege and a joy. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Suckle from the breast of the great mother, tingling with sweet lips, honey tongue, tickled toes, a babe in the embrace of all. Drink, 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 drink from the mother. Feel her love, feel her forgiveness, her acceptance, her warmth. It's you. It is I. Surrender to all pain. Surrender to all fear. Surrender to love. Love. Give everything to love. Transition, a veil lifted, and the world stands as it is, naked and alive, breathing, Jesus.